Well, hi, I'm Joy Overstreet, and I'm going to read for you today a chapter from my book, The Cherry Pie Paradox, The Surprising Path to Diet Freedom and Lasting Weight Loss. And this is a chapter 17, Rate Your Food, SuperTool number 4, which I think is helpful for every one of us, whether you're trying to lose weight or just want to enjoy your food more, or whether you're a wine taster or a cook who wants to have a more discriminating palate. Anyway, this is a tool that I think everyone could benefit from. So I'm going to read you this chapter. The first is a quote from Marshall McLuhan. Most of our assumptions have outlived their uselessness. To release excess pounds, I knew that I'd have to eat less, but how could I do this without feeling deprived the way I always did when I was on a diet? My daughter, Heather, who was 7 at the time, gave me the answer: become a picky eater. Don't waste calories on inferior food. In fairness, Heather was not a picky eater. She was a discriminating eater. She wasn't blinded by prior assumptions about how a food should taste. She judged the food in her mouth on its own merits. Here's how the idea for SuperTool number 4 came to me. My carrot epiphany. For an afternoon snack, I'd set out a small plate of carrot sticks. Heather took a bite of one stick and refused to eat any more. "Hey," I said, "you like carrots? They're sweet and crunchy." "Not this one," she said, pushing her plate toward me. "It's dry and it isn't sweet either." I reached across the counter to try one for myself. She was right. It sat like tasteless cardboard in my mouth. Not that I'd ever eaten cardboard, but I could imagine it. What do you know? A carrot that didn't live up to my expectations. This troubled me. How did I think a carrot would taste? Did I even notice when it didn't taste or feel as I expected? And if it wasn't up to snuff, did I eat it anyway? Of course I did. It was a carrot. I had a belief formed decades ago that carrots were sweet, crunchy, and good for me. After that, I must have stopped experiencing them, instead eating memories of the original carrot, which might have been from my father's own garden. But this was a different vegetable. I spit it out. If I were to rate it on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being yuck and 10 being yum, this carrot rated a 2 at best. I pulled several more carrots from the fridge for a taste test. I peeled one from the bunch I'd served Heather and one from a fresher bunch. The carrot from the tired bunch didn't have the wet sheen under the peel like the newer one did. It arched slightly, whereas the newer one broke when I tried bending it. The newer one smelled earthy and carroty. As I chomped down on it, its sweetness spread quickly to my tongue. Heather's carrot had no odor, juice, sweetness, or flavor. No wonder she didn't want it. For someone who had claimed to love food, I had deluded myself. I wasn't tasting the food in my mouth. I was tasting my belief about it based on some earlier experience. Long ago, I decided carrots tasted good and were good for you, regardless of the evidence in my mouth. Just as each person is unique, so is each humble carrot and every other food. What about the sweet treats I loved, like chocolate? Excuse me, I have a hair in my mouth. Okay, sorry. What about sweet treats I loved, like chocolate? I love anything and everything chocolate, or so I told myself. I had called myself a chocoholic for years, rarely stopping to discern whether it was any good. To test myself, I found some Hershey's Kisses left over from Easter. Normally, I'd free the candy from the foil and pop it into my mouth. In a couple of chews, it would be gone, and I'd be ready for another. This time, I took my time and focused on every sensory aspect of the kiss. First, I noticed that the mere sight of the shiny wrap caused my salivary glands to spurt. It set my heart beating a little faster. I slowly pulled its paper tab and, like a striptease, peeled back the foil a little at a time, gradually revealing the waxy brown mountain inside. I stroked it with my index finger to see if it felt as waxy as it looked. It did. Not so appealing. I smelled it. It even smelled a bit waxy, with just a hint of cocoa. I licked it. It took several seconds for the exterior to melt enough that any flavor reached my tongue. I was surprised that the first flavor I registered was a slight sourness, followed by a cloying sweetness. It wasn't until I bit off a third of the kiss and pressed it into the roof of my mouth that I tasted any chocolate flavor at all. I let the bite melt and slowly trickle down my throat. At this point, I rated it about halfway between yuck and yum. After I swallowed, I waited for any lingering flavor. What lingered was sourness, a sourness that made me want to cover it by taking another bite. Instead, I marched over to my trusty garbage can and tossed it in. My rating had plummeted. How many precious calories had I wasted on mediocre chocolate? No more. Next, I decided to taste test some brownies. I made a batch from scratch using the recipe on the back of the can of cocoa and compared it to a batch I made from a mix. The difference in texture, crummy versus chewy, and flavor intensity was dramatic. Having done that test, I can now tell at first bite if a brownie is for real. I have not eaten a brownie from a box mix since, although they have gotten a little better since this was like 40 years ago. Very recently, I learned why my expectations and taste buds didn't align. My brain had already made its mind up and left the building. Fascinating new research in neuroscience has discovered that the brain is not so much reactive to all the sensory data coming in as it is predictive. Guessing what might happen next on the basis of prior similar experience is a more efficient use of its energy budget. In my case, eating carrots or chocolate, my brain expects that the experience will be pleasurable, so it doesn't pay much attention to the reality in my mouth unless it's markedly different or I'm really focused on the experience. The fact that the same food could rate differently at different stages of consumption was my other big aha. For example, in first looking at the Hershey's Kiss, I had high expectations of how it was going to taste. If it were on a scale of 1 to 10, I expected at least an 8 or 9. But my first bite rated about a 3 because I had trouble getting past the waxiness. Middle bite, when the chocolate flavor became more apparent, 6. Last bite, 8. Mouth taste about a minute after I finished, sour, -1. I also discovered that even something as yummy as the brownie from scratch, which had started at 10, dropped down to 6 at the last bite, not because the flavor had changed, but because my taste buds got bored. That's known as hedonic adaptation. Furthermore, the same food could rate differently depending on how hungry I was. For example, trail mix isn't very interesting, but after I'd just hiked 5 miles up a mountain, every raisin or peanut tasted amazing. Since I wanted to become a more discriminating eater, rating my food seemed like the best way to begin. It gave me something useful to focus on as I ate. It woke up my taste buds, and as a pleasing byproduct, it made me a better cook. So here's the exercise that I invite you to try. For the next week, keep a simple food diary that just lists each food as you eat it and your rating of it, using a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being yuck, 10 being yum. And but anything that is, below 5, below 4 maybe, is probably not worth the caloric input, and you might consider setting it aside. If you want to make the exercise more interesting, you could enter 3 numbers on your little chart: a rating for how you expect the food to taste, a rating for the first bite, and a rating for the last bite. Try this several times a week and see what you discover. You may be surprised. I hope this is helpful. Anyway, it's a reading from chapter 17 of the Cherry Pie Paradox.